His hands shook as he reached for his wallet. Just a slight tremor, the kind that comes with 8 decades of living, of carrying weight most people never will. The young man behind him in line snickered. Actually snickered, like watching an old man struggle to count out exact change was the funniest thing he'd seen all week. The coffee shop fell into that particular kind of silence, the kind where everyone pretends not to notice, but absolutely everyone is watching, waiting. Some with pity, others with impatience, a few with that cruel amusement that comes so easy. When you're young and think you'll never be old, the barista, barely old enough to vote, tapped her fingers against the counter. Not maliciously, but with that rhythmic impatience of someone who has places to be and things to do and absolutely no time for shaky hands that can't seem to grip a $20 bill properly. The old man's fingers, weathered and spotted with age, fumbled with the worn leather wallet. It was an old thing, that wallet. The kind they don't make anymore. Thick, honest leather that had been carried in a back pocket for probably 40 years or more. "Come on, Grandpa," someone muttered from the back of the line. "We don't have all day." The old man's shoulders hunched slightly, the way they do when dignity takes a hit but pride refuses to let you turn around and respond. He kept his eyes down, focused on the task at hand, trying to extract exact change from a wallet that seemed determined to make this as difficult as possible. His coffee order was simple. Black coffee, large. No foam art, no complicated syrup combinations, no half-calf double-shot oat milk extra hot nonsense, just coffee. The kind of coffee men his age had been drinking since before these kids were born. But simple doesn't matter when your hands shake and the world has forgotten how to wait. The snickering grew louder. 3 young men, probably college students, probably never worked a day in their lives that actually mattered, found this absolutely hilarious. One of them pulled out his phone. Because of course he did. Because in 2024, humiliation isn't complete until it's documented and shared with the world. The camera pointed directly at those trembling hands, at the bowed shoulders, at the quiet dignity of a man who was just trying to buy a cup of coffee. "This is going straight to TikTok," one of them whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Look, at this old guy. Probably can't even remember what he ordered." The barista's impatience grew more obvious. She glanced at the line behind him, at the clock on the wall, anywhere but at his face. Because looking at his face might have required seeing him as a person instead of an inconvenience. Might have required noticing the careful way he straightened his shoulders, the precise way he tried to control those shaking hands, the quiet respect with which he treated everyone around him despite receiving none in return. His fingers finally managed to extract a $20 bill. It fluttered slightly in his grip, betraying the tremor he was working so hard to control. He placed it carefully on the counter, then began the process of counting out additional change. Exact change. Because men of his generation believed in exact change, in not making things more difficult than they needed to be, in showing consideration for others, even when others showed none for him. The phone kept recording. The snickers kept coming. The line kept growing more restless. And then, it happened. As he reached back into his wallet, trying to find another quarter, his shaking fingers lost their grip. The wallet tumbled from his hands, landing on the coffee shop floor with a soft thud that somehow seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Bills scattered, credit cards slid across the worn wooden planks, and something else fell out, something that glinted gold and blue and red in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Something that made every person in that coffee shop stop breathing for just a moment. But what they didn't know about what had just fallen from that old wallet would change everything. Would turn their cruel laughter into stunned silence. Would transform their impatience into something approaching reverence. Because that wasn't just any trembling old man standing at that counter, fumbling with exact change and enduring their mockery with quiet dignity. That man had a story. A story that would make every single person in that room question everything they thought they knew about the stranger in front of them. The wallet lay open on the floor, its contents scattered like pieces of a life lived fully and completely. But it was that one particular item, that flash of gold and blue and red, that would soon reveal why those hands shook not just with age, but with the weight of memories most people couldn't even imagine carrying. His name was Harold Peterson, though nobody in that coffee shop knew it yet. They saw only what they chose to see. An inconvenient old man with shaking hands and outdated clothes. Someone who moved too slowly for their fast-paced world. They didn't see the man who had once moved with precision and purpose through jungles half a world away. They didn't see the steady hands that had once held a rifle with deadly accuracy, or the strong back that had once carried wounded comrades to safety. They saw only what age had made visible, not what courage had made possible. Harold had been coming to this particular coffee shop for 3 years now, ever since his wife Margaret had passed and the big house had become too quiet for comfort. The ritual had become important to him. Wake up at 600 hours, shower and shave with military precision, dress in clothes that were clean and pressed even if they were decades old, and walk the 6 blocks to Murphy's Coffee Company for one large black coffee and exactly 30 minutes of human interaction. It wasn't much, but it was routine. And routine had kept him alive in places where routine was the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming another casualty statistic. The barista finally looked at him, really looked at him, as he slowly bent to retrieve his scattered belongings. There was something in his movement, even at 82 years old, that spoke of ingrained discipline. The way he knelt wasn't the careful, fragile movement of a typical elderly man. It was economical, purposeful, controlled, but the young people behind him weren't paying attention to such details. They were too busy being entertained by what they perceived as weakness. Somebody should probably help him, a woman's voice said from somewhere in the line. She sounded uncertain, like she was suggesting something radical. "He's fine," one of the college students replied. "Old people need to do things for themselves or they lose it completely." Such wisdom from someone who had probably never been responsible for anything more complicated than a term paper deadline. Harold's fingers closed around the scattered bills, methodically organizing them back into his wallet. His movements were careful, not because of infirmity, but because of ingrained habit. In his world, everything had a place and everything stayed in its place. Order wasn't just preference, it had once been survival. The phone was still recording. The snickering had died down slightly, but the impatience remained thick in the air like smoke from a cigarette. Nobody wanted to acknowledge they were breathing. If you believe that dignity doesn't diminish with age, that respect should be earned through character rather than speed, then this story deserves to be heard. Because what's about to unfold in this ordinary coffee shop will remind you why assumptions can be dangerous, and why the quiet heroes among us often look nothing like what we expect heroes to look like. The truth about Harold Peterson was written in scars they couldn't see and memories they couldn't imagine. But it was also written on a piece of metal and ribbon that had just fallen from his wallet, lying there on the coffee shop floor like a secret finally ready to be revealed. The weight of that metal wasn't just in its gold and its significance. It was in the moment that had earned it, in the choice that had defined not just Harold's life, but the lives of 7 other men who had gone home to their families because of what Harold had done on a Tuesday morning in 1968, in a place called Quezon, when courage looked like a 20-year-old kid with steady hands and an unwavering commitment to the idea that no one gets left behind. But they didn't know that yet. All they knew was that an old man had dropped his wallet and was taking too long to pick up the pieces. Harold's fingers finally located the item that had fallen separately from his wallet. The Medal of Honor lay on the worn wooden floor, its star-shaped metal catching the light in a way that seemed almost purposeful, almost like it was tired of being hidden away and was ready to tell its story. He picked it up carefully, reverently, the way one handles something that represents not just personal achievement, but sacred trust. For a moment, his hand stopped shaking entirely. For a moment, the tremor that had been the source of so much amusement simply disappeared, replaced by the steady grip of a man who had once been trusted with life and death decisions. The college student with the phone had stopped recording, not out of respect, but because he was confused by what he was seeing. The object in the old man's hand didn't fit the narrative of helpless elderly man that had been so entertaining just moments before. "What is that?" someone asked. Harold looked up from where he knelt on the floor. His eyes, which had seemed watery and uncertain before, now held something different, something that made several people in line take an unconscious step backward. Those weren't the eyes of a helpless old man. Those were the eyes of someone who had seen things, done things, survived things that most people only experienced in movies. "It's nothing," Harold said quietly, starting to close his hand around the metal. "Just something old." But the barista had seen it now, really seen it, and recognition was dawning on her face like sunrise after the longest night of your life. "Sir," she said, her voice completely different now. "Sir, is that a Medal of Honor?" The coffee shop went completely silent, not the awkward silence of before, when people were pretending not to notice. This was the silence of sudden understanding, of assumptions crashing into reality like waves against stone. Harold looked around the room, at all the faces now turned toward him with something approaching attention. Real attention. For the first time since he'd walked through those doors, he could have said yes, could have stood up, straightened his shoulders and allowed them to see him for what he really was. Could have accepted the apologies that would surely come, the embarrassed shuffling, the sudden respect that would feel hollow because it came only after proof had been provided. Instead, he simply said, "I just wanted to buy some coffee." But the barista wasn't letting it go. She had a grandfather who had served in Vietnam, had grown up hearing stories about the kind of men who came home different, who carried weight that couldn't be seen but could certainly be felt. She knew what she was looking at, even if nobody else in the room quite understood yet. "Sir, that's a Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that reached every corner of the room. The college student who had been recording slowly lowered his phone. The woman who had been tapping her fingers against the counter stared at Harold with new eyes. The man who had muttered about not having all day suddenly found himself very interested in studying his shoes. Harold closed his fingers around the metal and slowly stood up. His movements were still careful, still controlled, but now people understood that the care wasn't about fragility. It was about precision, about doing things right, the way they had always been done right, because doing things right had once been the difference between his squad coming home or not coming home at all. "It was a long time ago," he said simply, but the barista wasn't finished. She had moved around the counter now, was standing closer to Harold than anyone else in the room dared to get. "What's your name, sir?" "Harold Peterson." She extended her hand, and when Harold shook it, she used both of her hands to grasp his one. The gesture was small, but it was recognition. It was the respect that should have been offered freely, not earned through proof of worthiness. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Peterson." The words seemed to unlock something in the room. Other people began to move, to speak, to approach. But Harold looked uncomfortable with the attention, the way heroes often do when their heroism becomes public knowledge. "I just wanted to buy some coffee," he repeated, but there was something different in his voice now. Something tired. Not physically tired, but tired in the way that comes from carrying stories that nobody wants to hear until they're forced to listen. The college student who had been recording approached slowly, his phone now tucked away in his pocket. "Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't know." "You didn't know what?" Harold asked, and there was no anger in his voice, just genuine curiosity. "You didn't know I was a person worthy of basic respect?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and nobody seemed to know how to answer it, because that was the heart of it, wasn't it? Harold Peterson had been worthy of respect before they knew about the medal, had been worthy of patience and courtesy and basic human decency, not because of what he had done in Vietnam in 1968, but because he was a human being who deserved to be treated with dignity regardless of how fast he could count exact change. The medal was just proof of something that should have been obvious from the beginning, that every person in that room was standing in the presence of someone whose story they couldn't begin to understand. Now you might be wondering what exactly Harold Peterson had done to earn the nation's highest military honor. You might be curious about that Tuesday morning in 1968, about the choices that had been made and the lives that had been saved. But before we get to that story, before we dive into the mud and blood and impossible courage of Khe Sanh, we need to talk about the man who made those choices. Because heroes aren't born heroes. They're forged by circumstance and shaped by character. and understanding the hero requires understanding the man. Harold Peterson had been born in 1942 in a small town in Nebraska that most people couldn't find on a map if you gave them 3 guesses and a magnifying glass. His father had been a farmer, his mother a schoolteacher, and Harold had grown up understanding that hard work was virtue and character was currency, and you treated everyone with respect regardless of whether they could do anything for you in return. When he turned 18 in 1960, the world was a different place. Vietnam was still a distant concern, something happening to other people in a place that might as well have been on another planet. Harold had planned to follow his father into farming, to marry his high school sweetheart Sarah, to raise kids in the same small town where he had learned that your word was your bond and your actions defined your character. But then came the draft notice in 1963. Harold Peterson reported for duty not because he wanted to be a hero, but because when your country calls, you answer. Simple as that. It wasn't about politics or ideology or grand statements about freedom and democracy. It was about duty, pure and simple. The kind of duty that his parents had taught him was as natural as breathing and as necessary as water. Basic training revealed what those who knew Harold could have predicted. He was a natural leader, not because he was the loudest or the strongest or the most aggressive, but because when things got difficult, other men instinctively looked to him for guidance. He had that rare quality that can't be taught or faked. When Harold Peterson said something would be okay, people believed him. By 1967, he was a staff sergeant leading a squad of 12 men through the jungles of South Vietnam. These weren't career soldiers or military academy graduates. They were kids mostly, pulled from small towns and big cities, from farms and factories, united only by the fact that their country had asked them to serve, and they had answered that call. Harold's squad was tight. They had learned to depend on each other in ways that civilians couldn't understand. In the jungle, trust wasn't emotional luxury, it was practical necessity. You trusted the man next to you to do his job, to watch your back, to make the right choice when the wrong choice meant everyone died. They called him steady because his hands never shook no matter how bad things got. No matter how close the mortars fell or how heavy the gunfire became, Harold Peterson's hands remained rock steady. It became something of a legend in his unit. If Steady's hands were calm, everything was going to be all right. The irony wasn't lost on him now, standing in a coffee shop where people had laughed at those same hands because age had finally made them tremble. But hands weren't the only thing that had been steady about Staff Sergeant Harold Peterson. His judgment had been steady too. His commitment to his men had been unwavering. His refusal to leave anyone behind had been absolute. Which brings us to February 23, 1968. Khe Sanh, a place that existed on military maps but shouldn't have existed in any rational universe, where young American men were asked to hold ground that seemed designed by geometry and defended by pure stubbornness. Harold's squad had been pinned down for 3 hours by sniper fire. 3 hours of lying in mud that was part water, part blood, and part things nobody wanted to identify. They were taking casualties, and their position was becoming untenable. The smart tactical decision was to withdraw, to fall back to more defensible ground, to regroup and try again later. But Private Martinez was wounded and couldn't move under his own power. And Corporal Johnson was trapped in a shell crater about 50 meters away, too far to reach safely but close enough to hear him calling for help. The squad could withdraw, should withdraw. Harold had the authority to make that call, and nobody would have questioned it. Nobody except Harold Peterson, because Harold Peterson had made a promise to each of his men and to their mothers and fathers and wives and girlfriends back home. The promise wasn't spoken, wasn't written down anywhere, wasn't part of any official military code, but it was real nonetheless. The promise was simple. Everybody goes home, not most people, not the people who were easy to save. Everybody. So on that Tuesday morning in 1968, with sniper fire turning the air above his head into a deadly buzzsaw, Staff Sergeant Harold Peterson made a choice that would define not just his own life, but the lives of 7 other men who were depending on him to keep that unspoken promise. He stood up, right there in the middle of a firefight. With bullets snapping past his head like angry wasps, Harold Peterson stood up and began moving across 50 meters of open ground toward the crater where Corporal Johnson was bleeding out. His hands were steady as he returned fire with his M16. Steady as he dragged Johnson back to relative safety. Steady as he organized the evacuation of Private Martinez. Steady as he held that position alone for 45 minutes while the rest of his squad got the wounded men to safety. By the time backup arrived, Harold had been hit twice. Once in the shoulder, once in the leg. But he was still firing, still. Holding that impossible position, still making sure that everybody went home. All 7 men in Harold's squad survived that day. 7 men who went on to marry their sweethearts, to raise children, to build lives and careers and legacies of their own. 7 men who owed their futures to a farm kid from Nebraska who believed that promises meant something, even when keeping them might cost you everything, especially when keeping them might cost you everything. The Medal of Honor citation would later read that Staff Sergeant Harold Peterson had shown conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But Harold knew better. He knew that what he had done wasn't above and beyond anything. It was exactly what duty required, exactly what his promises demanded, exactly what his character wouldn't let him avoid. He had simply done what needed to be done, because someone needed to do it, and he happened to be the someone who was there. Medal had been presented to him in a ceremony at the White House 6 months later. President Johnson had placed it around his neck and shaken his hand and said words about honor and courage and sacrifice. Harold had smiled and nodded and said, "Thank you, sir," because that's what you did when the President of the United States was talking to you. But the real medal, the one that mattered, was carried in the letters he received over the years from 7 families. Letters from wives thanking him for making sure their husbands came home. Letters from children who existed because their fathers had survived February 23, 1968. Letters from grandchildren who would never know how close they had come to never existing at all. That was the medal that really mattered, not the one made of gold and ribbon, but the one made of lives lived and families raised and futures that were possible because a 25-year-old staff sergeant had believed that everybody deserved to go home. Now, 56 years later, that same man stood in a coffee shop, holding that medal in hands that shook with age, looking at people who had laughed at his infirmity without ever imagining what those hands had once been capable of accomplishing. The silence in Murphy's Coffee Company stretched on, thick with the weight of revelation and the discomfort of assumptions, proved wrong. Harold looked around the room at faces that had transformed from mockery to something approaching shame, and he felt tired. Not physically tired, though the years had certainly taken their toll, but tired in his soul. Tired of being invisible until he could prove he was worth seeing. Tired of earning respect that should have been freely given. Tired of living in a world that valued youth over wisdom, speed over deliberation, efficiency over dignity. "The coffee's $4.50, the barista said softly, and Harold realized that somehow, in all the drama and revelation, they had forgotten about the simple transaction that had started this entire episode. He reached back into his wallet, his hands steady now, and extracted a $5 bill. His movements were careful, precise, controlled. The movements of a man who had learned long ago that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. The barista rang up the sale, but when Harold reached for the change, she shook her head. "No charge, sir. Thank you for your service." "I can pay for my coffee," Harold said quietly. "I know you can, sir, but I'd like to buy it for you if that's all right." Harold looked at her for a long moment, studying her face. She was young, probably 22 or 23, with kind eyes and genuine sincerity. She reminded him a little of his granddaughter, Kelly, who was about the same age and had the same earnest way of trying to do the right thing. "What's your name?" he asked. "Jessica." "Well, Jessica, I appreciate the gesture. But I've been paying for my own coffee for 82 years, and I'm not going to stop now." He placed the $5 bill on the counter with the same precision he had shown earlier, but now people understood that the precision wasn't about infirmity. It was about character, about doing things right because doing things right mattered, regardless of whether anyone was watching or caring or keeping score. Jessica made change and handed it to him with both hands, the same gesture of respect she had shown earlier. Harold pocketed the change and picked up his coffee, a simple black coffee in a plain white cup that had somehow become the centerpiece of a story about dignity and respect, and the assumptions we make about the people around us. The college student, who had been recording, approached again, more hesitant this time. "Sir, I deleted the video. I'm sorry I recorded it in the first place." Harold looked at him for a long moment. The young man was probably 20 years old, clean-cut, well-dressed, the kind of kid who had grown up with advantages and opportunities, and the assumption that the world owed him efficiency and convenience. "What's your name?" Harold asked. "Tyler." "Tyler, can I ask you something?" "Yes, sir." "What made you think it was funny? An old man with shaking hands trying to buy coffee?" Tyler shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with an answer that wouldn't make him sound like the callous young man he was beginning to realize he had been. "I don't know, sir. I guess I didn't think about it. Didn't think about you as a person." "But I was a person before you knew about this," Harold said, gesturing to the medal that was now back in his wallet. "I was a person when you started recording. I was a person when you were laughing. The medal doesn't make me a person worthy of respect, Tyler. Being a person makes me a person worthy of respect." The words weren't harsh, weren't delivered with anger or condemnation. They were simply true, spoken with the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to speak truth, regardless of whether people wanted to hear it. Tyler nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "Yes, sir. You're right. I'm not trying to make you feel bad," Harold continued. "I'm trying to help you understand something that might serve you well as you get older. Every person you meet is carrying a story you can't see. Every person who moves slower than you'd like, who takes longer than you think they should, who doesn't meet your expectations for speed or efficiency or whatever standard you've decided to apply. Every one of those people has a story." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. It was good coffee, strong and hot, and exactly what he had wanted when he walked through those doors. Some of those stories are about war and medals and moments of courage, but most of them are simpler than that. Stories about love and loss, about dreams achieved and dreams deferred, about children raised and spouses buried, about ordinary people living ordinary lives with extraordinary dignity. All of those stories deserve respect, Tyler. Not because of what people have accomplished, but because of who they are. The coffee shop remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the uncomfortable silence of people pretending not to notice, but the thoughtful silence of people actually listening. "I understand, sir," Tyler said. "And I'm sorry, really sorry." Harold nodded. "I know you are, and I appreciate that." He looked around the room one more time, at faces that had been transformed by understanding, at people who had been forced to confront their own assumptions about age and worth and who deserved their patience. But Harold Peterson was tired of being a teaching moment, tired of being a lesson in humanity, tired of having to prove his worth through dramatic revelation. He just wanted to drink his coffee. So he found his usual table in the corner, the one by the window where he could watch the street and remember Margaret, and he sat down with his simple black coffee and tried to pretend that the last 30 minutes hadn't happened. But of course they had happened. And the coffee shop would never be quite the same, because now everyone knew that the quiet old man who came in every morning at the same time and ordered the same thing was carrying stories they couldn't imagine. Jessica brought him a newspaper without being asked, and Harold smiled his thanks. It was a small gesture, but it was recognition, not of his military service, but of his humanity, of the fact that he was a regular customer who deserved courtesy and consideration, medal or no medal. Other customers began to leave, filing past his table with nods of acknowledgement and murmured words of thanks. Harold accepted these graciously, but he could see in their eyes that they were still processing what they had learned, still trying to reconcile the image of the fumbling old man with the reality of the war hero. What they didn't understand was that there was no reconciliation necessary. He had always been both. The trembling hands and the steady courage weren't contradictions. They were simply different chapters in the same story. The story of a man who had lived fully, served faithfully, and aged with the same dignity he had shown in every other phase of his life. Tyler lingered near the door, clearly wanting to say something more, but uncertain what that something should be. Finally, he approached Harold's table. "Sir, could I ask you about something?" Harold looked up from his newspaper. "What would you like to know?" "The other men in your squad, the ones you saved. Do you still keep in touch with them?" Harold smiled. And for the first time since the wallet had fallen, the smile reached his eyes. "Two of them. Martinez lives in Phoenix now, has 6 grandchildren. Johnson passed away 3 years ago, but his son sends me Christmas cards. The others, well, we lost touch over the years, but I get letters sometimes. From their children, their grandchildren. People who exist because of what happened that day." "That must be incredible," Tyler said, "knowing that you changed so many lives." Harold considered this for a moment, stirring his coffee slowly. "The thing is, Tyler, we all change lives. Every day, in ways we never realize. Every kindness, every moment of patience, every decision to treat someone with dignity instead of dismissal, all of that changes lives. My story is dramatic because there were bullets involved, but everyone has opportunities to make choices that matter." He gestured toward the counter where Jessica was serving the next customer with obvious care and attention. "Jessica there, she's changing lives. Every customer she treats with respect, every small kindness she shows. That matters. You could change lives too, if you decided to see people as people instead of inconveniences." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "I never thought about it that way. Most people don't," Harold said. "We're taught to think that heroism looks like Hollywood movies. Big dramatic moments, explosions, people running toward danger. But real heroism is usually quieter than that. It's choosing patience when you're in a hurry. It's showing respect when it would be easier to show irritation. It's recognizing that every person you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about." Tyler pulled out the chair across from Harold. "Would it be okay if I sat for a minute?" Harold gestured to the chair. "Of course. Can I ask what it was like, coming home after the war?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Harold had been asked this before by reporters and historians and well-meaning family members, but he had always given the standard answers, the polite responses that acknowledged the question without really answering it. But something about Tyler's genuine curiosity, about the transformation that had taken place in this young man over the course of a single morning, made Harold consider giving a more honest answer. "It was harder than the war in some ways," he said finally. "In Vietnam, you knew who your friends were. You knew who you could trust. You knew what the mission was, even when everything else was chaos. Coming home was different." He paused, looking out the window at the street where ordinary people were going about their ordinary lives, unaware that they were being observed by someone who had seen the absolute worst and best of human nature. "People didn't know what to do with us. Some treated us like heroes, which was uncomfortable because we didn't feel like heroes. We felt like survivors. Others treated us like criminals, like we were personally responsible for an unpopular war. Most people just wanted to forget the whole thing, pretend it had never happened." Tyler listened intently, and Harold found himself continuing. "I came home to a country that had moved on without me. My friends were married, starting careers, buying houses. I was 26 years old and I felt ancient. I had seen things, done things, that I couldn't talk about at dinner parties. I had nightmares that I couldn't explain to people who thought war was what they saw in movies." "How did you handle it?" "Routine," Harold said immediately. "Structure. I got a job at the post office, worked there for 37 years. Same schedule every day, same routes, same sense of purpose. I married Margaret in 1971. We had 2 children, 4 grandchildren. I coached Little League, volunteered at the church, served on the town council for 12 years. He smiled, remembering. "Margaret used to say that I approached civilian life like a military operation. Everything planned, everything organized, everything done right the first time. She wasn't wrong. The discipline I learned in the Army served me well in regular life." "Did people know about the medal?" "Some did. It wasn't a secret, but it wasn't something I advertised either. The medal was important, but it represented one day out of my entire life. A significant day, but still just one day. I was more proud of the 37 years I spent delivering mail without losing a single piece. More proud of the 53 years I was married to Margaret. More proud of watching my children grow up to be good people. Tyler seemed to process this information carefully. But don't those other accomplishments seem smaller compared to saving 7 lives? Harold shook his head. Tyler, there's nothing small about living a good life. There's nothing insignificant about being a good husband, a good father, a good neighbor. The medal represents one moment of courage, but character is built over decades of smaller choices, daily decisions to do the right thing even when no one is watching. He leaned back in his chair, studying the young man across from him. You want to know something? I'm more proud of the fact that I never missed one of my daughter's soccer games than I am of anything that happened in Vietnam. I'm more proud of the 40 years I spent taking care of Margaret when she got sick than I am of any medal. Taking care of her? Alzheimer's, Harold said simply. Started when she was 68. Took her piece by piece over 10 years. By the end, she didn't recognize me. Didn't know where she was, who she was talking to, what year it was. But I was there every day. Fed her, bathed her, read to her, played her favorite music, held her hand when she was scared and confused. Tyler's eyes widened slightly. Now that was heroism, Harold continued. Not the kind that gets medals or recognition, or newspaper articles, but real heroism nonetheless. The kind that happens in hospital rooms and nursing homes and quiet bedrooms all over this country. People taking care of people they love, even when love becomes duty and duty becomes the only thing holding you together. The coffee shop had grown busier around them, but their conversation continued in a bubble of mutual respect and genuine curiosity. Is that why your hands shake? Tyler asked gently. From taking care of her? Harold looked down at his hands, which were indeed trembling, slightly as they held his coffee cup. Partly. Age mostly. But yes, the stress of those years took a toll. 10 years of watching someone you love disappear slowly, of being strong for someone who can't be strong for themselves. It changes you. It exhausts you in ways that combat never did. He set down his coffee cup and looked directly at Tyler. But I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Every sleepless night, every difficult day, every moment of heartbreak. Because that's what love looks like when it's tested. Not the romantic love you see in movies, but the real love that shows up every day regardless of circumstances. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, clearly moved by Harold's honesty. I'm sorry for your loss, he said finally. Thank you. She was a remarkable woman. Taught second grade for 42 years, touched thousands of lives. Never got a medal for it. Never got recognition, but she changed the world one child at a time. Harold smiled, remembering. She would have handled this morning differently than I did. Margaret never met a stranger. She would have engaged with you young people, asked about your studies, your families, your dreams. She would have turned this whole incident into a teaching moment about kindness and respect. But she would have done it with such grace that you would have walked away feeling better about yourselves instead of ashamed. She sounds amazing. She was. And she taught me something important about heroism. Real heroism isn't about single moments of dramatic courage. It's about showing up consistently, day after day, year after year. It's about treating people with dignity, even when they don't treat you with dignity. It's about doing the right thing because it's the right thing, not because anyone will notice or care or give you credit. Harold finished his coffee and began to gather his things. The medal is important, Tyler. Don't misunderstand me. I'm proud of what I did that day, proud of the men I served with, proud of my service to my country. But I'm equally proud of Margaret's service to her students, of my service to my postal customers, of our service to our children and grandchildren. He stood up slowly, his movements careful but not fragile. The world needs all kinds of heroism. The dramatic kind that gets medals in movies, yes, but also the quiet kind that happens in classrooms and post offices and family homes. The kind that shows up in coffee shops when young people choose patience over mockery, respect over entertainment. Tyler stood as well, extending his hand. Thank you, sir. for the service, but also for the conversation. I learned more in the last hour than I have in months. Harold shook his hand firmly. Just remember what you learned, Tyler. And more importantly, use what you learned. The next time you see someone struggling with exact change, someone moving slower than you'd like, someone who doesn't meet your expectations for efficiency, remember that they're carrying stories you can't see. Treat them the way you'd want someone to treat your grandfather, your grandmother, your parents when they're old. I will, sir. I promise. Harold nodded and turned to leave, but Tyler called. After him, Mr. Peterson, will you be here tomorrow morning? Harold paused at the door, looking back at the young man who had been transformed from mockery to respect in the span of a single conversation. Same time, same order, he said. Same table by the window. Would it be okay if I joined you? Just to talk? Harold considered this for a moment. He had come to the coffee shop for solitude, for the comfort of routine and the simple pleasure of watching the world go by. But perhaps routine could accommodate new elements. Perhaps solitude could make room for connection. You're welcome to join me, Tyler. But I should warn you, I'm not very interesting. Just an old man with shaking hands who likes black coffee and quiet conversation. Tyler smiled. That sounds perfect, sir. Harold walked out of Murphy's Coffee Company and into the crisp morning air, feeling lighter than he had in months. Not because of the recognition or the respect or the delayed acknowledgement of his military service, but because of something simpler and more profound. He had connected with another human being, had shared his story, his wisdom, his perspective, with someone young enough to benefit from it and humble enough to listen. As he walked the 6 blocks back to his house, Harold reflected on the morning's events. The mockery had stung, yes, but it had also created an opportunity to teach, to share, to bridge the gap between generations that seemed to grow wider every year. The metal in his wallet felt heavier now, not because of its gold and significance, but because of the responsibility it represented. Not just the responsibility of heroism, but the responsibility of wisdom. The obligation to share what he had learned, to pass along the values that had sustained him through war and peace, through love and loss, through all the challenges that life had presented. His hands still shook as he unlocked his front door. They would continue to shake, would probably get worse as the years continued to pass. But now he understood something that he hadn't understood that morning. The shaking wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of a life fully lived, of burdens willingly carried, of service faithfully rendered. It was the physical manifestation of 8 decades of experience, of caring, of showing up every day, regardless of circumstances. Those hands had held weapons and babies with equal tenderness, had signed important documents and love letters with equal care, had worked and served and protected and provided for more than half a century. They had earned the right to shake. Harold made himself a simple lunch and settled into his favorite chair by the window. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the oppressive silence of loneliness. It was the peaceful silence of contentment, of a morning well spent, of connections made and wisdom shared. He thought about Tyler, about the transformation he had witnessed in that young man's face and voice and posture. From mockery to respect, from dismissal to curiosity, from judgment to understanding. It had been remarkable to watch, like seeing someone wake up from a dream they didn't know they were having. Margaret would have been proud. She had always believed in the power of patient teaching, of leading by example, of treating everyone with dignity regardless of their initial response to her. She would have loved Tyler's questions, would have appreciated his willingness to listen and learn. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Harold found himself looking forward to tomorrow morning's coffee ritual in a way he hadn't for months. Not just for the routine and the solitude, but for the conversation. For the opportunity to continue the dialogue that had begun so unexpectedly. He went to bed that night feeling grateful. Grateful for his service, for his memories, for his long marriage to Margaret, for his children and grandchildren. But also grateful for the reminder that his story wasn't finished yet. That there were still opportunities to serve, to teach, to make a difference in ways both large and small. The Medal of Honor sat in his wallet on the bedside table, no longer hidden away like a secret he was ashamed to reveal. Not displayed prominently like a trophy to be admired, but simply present, a reminder of one important day in a life full of important days. As Harold drifted off to sleep, he thought about tomorrow's conversation with Tyler, about the questions the young man might ask and the stories he might be ready to hear. He thought about the responsibility of wisdom, the obligation to share what he had learned with those who might benefit from his experience. And he thought about something Margaret used to say, something that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his life. Every day is a gift, Harold. What matters is what you do with it. Tomorrow would be another gift, another opportunity to choose patience over frustration, dignity over convenience, connection over isolation. Another chance to prove that heroism wasn't confined to single moments of dramatic courage, but could be found in the simple act of showing up, day after day, with your full humanity intact. Harold Peterson slept peacefully that night, his hands finally still, his conscience clear, his heart full of gratitude for a life well lived and wisdom well shared. And in a dorm room across town, Tyler lay awake thinking about respect and dignity and the stories that every person carries. Thinking about assumptions and judgments and the courage it takes to admit when you're wrong. Thinking about an old man with shaking hands who had taught him more about heroism in one morning than he had learned in 20 years of living. The next morning, Harold arrived at Murphy's Coffee Company at exactly 800 hours, just as he had every morning for 3 years. He ordered his large black coffee from Jessica, who greeted him with obvious warmth and respect, and made his way to his usual table by the window. Tyler was already there, waiting with his own coffee and a notebook filled with questions he hoped weren't too intrusive. He stood when Harold approached, a gesture of respect that hadn't been taught in any classroom, but had been learned in the space of a single revelatory conversation. "Good morning, Mr. Peterson." "Good morning, Tyler. Ready for that conversation?" Tyler smiled and gestured to the chair across from him. "Yes, sir. I've been looking forward to it all night." Harold sat down, arranged his coffee and newspaper just so, and looked across the table at a young man who had been transformed by understanding, who had learned that every person deserves respect not because of what they've accomplished, but because of who they are. It was going to be a good conversation, a good morning, a good day, the kind of day that Margaret would have called a gift, and that Harold intended to use well, because in the end, that's what heroism really looks like. Not just single moments of dramatic courage, but a lifetime of small choices to treat people with dignity, to share wisdom when it's needed, to connect across the gaps that divide us. One conversation at a time, one cup of coffee at a time, one moment of mutual respect at a time. If this story has reminded you to look beyond the surface, to see the dignity in every person regardless of their age or pace or apparent limitations, then perhaps you'll take a moment to reflect on the heroes in your own life. The quiet ones who show up every day without fanfare or recognition. The ones whose stories you might never know, but whose presence makes the world a better place simply by being in it. Because we're all carrying stories that others can't see. We're all deserving of patience and respect and the simple courtesy of being treated as human beings worthy of dignity. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, those stories get shared over a cup of coffee on an ordinary morning that turns out to be anything but ordinary.